Xpress Nation, we are officially starting week 1. Week 0 was a banger, Iowa State versus Kansas State. I'm a defensive guy, so that matchup for me was a great way to kick off college football. Hawaii versus Stanford was another late night thriller. I think Hawaii has an absolute dog at quarterback this year. I love to see how they will perform within the group of 5, but it's week 0, so we have week 0 football to talk about. And we're going to start the conversation with the quarterbacks because honestly, this might be one of the deepest years at the position I've seen. And I think we got some vets in that group with Cade Klubnik, Garrett Nussmeier, Drew Allard, Sam Levitt, along with some new faces with Jalen Sain, Ty Simpson, CJ Carr, that's really trying to set their mark on college football. And when you check out the matchups that we're getting just in week 1 with Cade versus Garrett, Arch versus Sain, Carr versus Beck, Simpson versus Castellato, Hoover versus Lopez. I mean, you're already getting thrilling matchups just in week 1. And when you really circle in on some of those big name matchups like Klubnik versus Nussmeier, both of them I think have a very similar style of play. Both are very mobile. We've seen that last year with Klubnik. He was able to run and was mobile enough to really extend plays. And he showed a level of mobility that I really doubted in him going into last year. I'm going to admit it. Going into 2024, I was not a big Cade Klubnik fan. I had a lot of doubts on him. He proved me wrong through and through. But for Nussmeier, I think, has a little bit bigger of an arm. So I think it's going to be a test on how those offenses really molded throughout the offseason. Then you got Texas versus Ohio State, Arch versus Sain. Both newcomers, both never started before. Arch having a little bit more experience, though, with Texas giving him the ability to get in some playtime last year. Sain transferring in to Ohio State, having to sit behind and wait his turn in college football. So with Arch, I mean, he honestly has some of the best tools. He's one of the most talented. I don't think there's any question marks on Arch's ability. And honestly, I don't think there's any question marks on if he can compose himself through an important game. I think most of the question marks sit on Jalen. But, I mean, when you look at his receiving core with Jeremiah Smith, Tate back there, plus the extra 4- and 5-star receivers that they brung in through the receiving class, because they have a freshman that has been balling out throughout camp. I mean, he has the receiving core in the offense to absolutely set him up for success. Then I think another one a lot of folks aren't talking about is Alabama versus FSU with Ty Simpson versus Thomas Castellato. Ty Simpson brings a new level to that passing game that Alabama's kind of been missing out on. And I think that will do wonders for Ryan Williams, a guy that I have a lot of expectations for. But then on the flip side with Florida State, I think Castellato brings that level of confidence and energy that they were missing out on last year. I think last year it was a very, very bad season. I mean, everybody can agree on that, 2-10. But when your quarterback underperforms, your quarterback doesn't have the confidence to lead your offense, then you're going to have problems. And I think that was a lot of their issue last year. You had a lot of players that weren't leaders, but were followers. And I think this year, with Castellato under center, I think that brings just a extra level of confidence. I think he can lead the team. I think it's all about how well that team actually gels. And, he's going to be set up for a true test having to face Alabama's front seven. Alabama's front seven is definitely top 3, top 5 in the SEC. Somewhere in the top 10. It's all debatable. But they're somewhere in the top 10 defensively. So it's going to be a real test for FSU starting off in week 1. And then another little underrated matchup that I don't think a lot of people are eyeing for the right reasons with UNC versus TCU. You have Hoover out of TCU, who was by far one of the best quarterbacks that TCU's had. He showed it last year, breaking records. Then you got Gio Lopez over at UNC, who transferred in from South Alabama. I think Bill Belichick being his first game, that's been the most important match, factor, and everybody's eyeing, okay, this is Bill's first game of the season. But I think that quarterback matchup is very important to watch. I think this is the ability, because we've seen with Rico Beck versus Avery Johnson, that a lot of folks had huge expectations on Rico Beck, and we kind of seen how those teams perform. Now, they were hurt a little bit, but if Hoover can really step in and perform at the expectations and really bring the same level that he had last year, and that TCU defense kind of improves a little bit, it helps gel around Hoover and relieve some of the pressure off of him, I think TCU could be a real dangerous team in the Big 12. And I really like Hoover. I got kind of high expectations for him, kind of under the radar guy. But keep your eyes on that quarterback matchup. So you can't talk about the quarterbacks and the offensive side of the ball without mentioning defense. And throughout Week 0 and so far throughout Week 1, we've seen a lot of great defenses, and we've seen a lot of great defensive games with Iowa State versus Kansas State, Hawaii versus Stanford. We've seen Cincinnati versus Nebraska. So I think that's kind of been the staple of Week 1. And I'm going to kind of circle that in because I think Week 1 is really going to showcase defense. I think over the last couple years we've really been led by offense. But I think Week 1 is going to really bring out the best defense. A couple defenses to watch, though. I would say Texas. Texas is going to be a big talking point for most of the season, especially early on, because when you look at their roster, they bring back so much talent defensively, and we're going to hit on a lot of these guys later on. But Colin Simmons, Anthony Hill Jr., Muhammad Taff, defensively, they are a unit. Alabama's kind of the same way. You got Tennessee, who I know, yes, they probably lost some guys here and there, but I would not doubt their defense. They rotated in 3 deep. They had 3 different units rotating in every single game. And you're just not going to lose that after 1 year. Clemson probably has the most talent returning outside of Penn State on their defensive side of the ball. You got Woods coming back, Parker coming back. The entire secondary is basically back, along with their entire linebacking core. So Clemson's defense is going to be extremely good. I think out of the Big 12, I don't think you can really sleep on Iowa's defense. I think Iowa State's defense, not Iowa's. Iowa State's defense. I really do believe, even with the injuries that they were dealing with, I really do believe Iowa State really could have the best defense. I know a lot of questions are on Texas Tech. How can that defense really perform with all the NIL money that was spent on the roster? But, you can't really rely on NIL. NIL isn't going to build a team. A team's going to be built through coaching and through the players coming together. But they have the talent to do so. They went out and grabbed Stanford transfer to really lead that edge, and he's one of the more prolific edge rushers in college football. South Carolina is a underrated team, I think, offensively and defensively. They're completely underrated. I don't think they're getting enough look. Kennard, I think, is going to be a really underrated edge rusher. And then when you look into the Big Ten, because we haven't talked about them yet, even with all that Ohio State lost defensively, they're still going to be one of the best in the nation. It's led by Caleb Downs and Sonny Styles. Michigan is going to be a reload. Even with what they lost in the D-line, their defense was their strongest point last year. I don't think I really have to say that, but Michigan's defense was their staple. It's been their staple, and it's going to continue to be their staple. And then, like I mentioned, Penn State, outside of Clemson, like I said, has some of the highest retention rating or return rating, roster retention. I'm stumbling on my words right now. I'm so sorry. Roster retention on their defense. And I think that's going to do them great wonders because, personally for me, I've said it. I made it an early statement on it. I think this will be the best year Penn State has to win the Big Ten. And I think it's really going to run through their defense. I think as much as people are excited about how that offense are going to perform, with Drew Allard, Singleton, Allen, all back there, at quarterback and their 2 running backs, I think defensively is going to really be what carries them through the Big Ten title game and potentially winning the whole thing. So we're going to take a quick break real quick to hit that trivia that I tested out last week, and we'll be right back into it. It's trivia time. Who was the last AP number 1 to lose the first game of the season? And in honor of Lee Corso's last college game day, when was the first time Lee Corso chose Ohio State? Go back. Who was the last AP number 1 to lose the first game of the season? And when was the first time Lee Corso chose the Ohio State helmet? All right, so we're back, and we have one more segment to cover before we get to our game day picks. I know it's been a rough ride, and I'll say I'm getting better. I know I got to get better. I've been stumbling on my words. I probably mispronounced a couple names. So, I mean, y'all can say what y'all want. Say what y'all want. I'm ready for the criticism. Trying to rush this in the morning before. Not perfect. What are y'all? Sorry. I apologize again. But we're going to go ahead and cover some coaches. We got Bill Belichick. This is his first year. Fred Brown out of Syracuse. He has done great things for the program. Kenny Dillingham out of Arizona State. He's probably the best Big 12 coach. And I know Deion. I love Deion. I think Deion's great. If Dillingham wasn't at Arizona State, I would say Deion is the best Big 12 coach. But what Dillingham has done, especially making the playoffs last year, I mean, pulling that roster together, putting them into the playoffs, I think Arizona State with Dillingham at the head coach is going to be a force to be reckoned with inside of the Big 12. But I didn't bring up the quarterbacks to talk about all the young guys that are coaching and all about the great coaches that are making headway. What I brought it up for is to talk about the guys who I have on hot seats. Brian Kelly at LSU, Lincoln Riley at USC, Brent Venables at Oklahoma. And those are just the 3 big names that, Hugh Freeze, can't forget about him, out of Auburn, that are all sitting on a hot seat. And when you look at Brian Kelly, the story for him is he's put out a great offense, but he's had terrible defenses. Offensively, he's had quarterbacks like Jaden Daniels, Garrett Nussmeier at receiver, Neighbors and Thomas Jr., and then Anderson from coming in this year, and Hilton and Baron Browning. Offensively, they have been an absolute unit, but defensively has been the worst part about them by far. I mean, a lot of their games they could have won over the last couple seasons if they just had a defense to hold down the fort. I mean, it's just that simple. Plus, he's lost every single LSU opener. And if you add in the fact on how good that conference is improving, how each team, not just your Georgia, your Alabama, or your Texas, but your South Carolina, Tennessee, are all coming around. Texas A&M's coming around. You have these Missouri. A lot of people probably doubt Missouri, but you can't doubt the production that they've put out on the field. So you have these other teams that haven't really done that great in the past. Now, actually improving inside, their program's actually improving. Now you have a 12-team playoff. I think the seat is just going to get hotter because if you're no longer competing with the guys like Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, or Texas, who are really the top 4 teams in the SEC, and you start competing with Texas A&M, and then you move down and start competing, your competition's Arkansas, who can barely be an 8-win team on a good season, then there's a lot of question marks. And I think this is the year that Brian Kelly really has to make a statement. And really, they have to make a statement defensively. I think even if they finish with a top 10 offense, if their defense bottoms out again and they go 8-4, then I think that's it for Kelly. If he can manage to pull out a 10-win season, and I'll say at least a top 25, top 20 defense, I would actually say top 20 to top 15 defense, then he's fine. But it's going to have to be a 10-win season with at least a top 20 to top 15 defense. Brent Venables is literally the opposite side of the coin. He's had great defenses, but he's had terrible offenses. I mean, his best offensive year was probably when Dylan Gabriel was under center for him. And, I was mentioning, with all these other teams improving, Oklahoma was a Big 12 powerhouse. They've been a powerhouse throughout most of college football. So now, they're really going to be looking to make that next jump because you got Beamer Ball with South Carolina. Like I mentioned, how they're improving. If Shane Beamer can figure out how to be consistent throughout the entire season and not just moments throughout games, and he can really manage to somehow put out a 10-win season and make a SEC champion. I think if Coach Beamer makes an SEC championship at some point in the next 3 years, then that is going to do wonders for South Carolina program. And Oklahoma is going to have to beat that race. Oklahoma is going to have to make, Brent Venables is going to have to make an SEC championship or at least the playoffs before South Carolina or A&M does. Because if either one of those programs manages to make the SEC or the playoffs, the impact that's going to have on their recruiting, because they're already, especially A&M, having the luxury of NIL money, is already getting top-end recruits, but they lose a lot of their top-end recruits because they're not winning games. So the playoff and SEC appearance is going to tremendously impact both those programs. And Oklahoma's not going to sit around and want to be the 7th or 8th best team in the SEC. They're really not going to accept being anything in the bottom 4, bottom 5 worst teams in the SEC. They want to be one of the best SEC team, or at least inside the top 3, competing with Alabama, with their rival Texas. And that's another note. If Brent Venables takes a huge loss like he did this last year against Texas, oh, you're talking about out the door. He will be out the door by the end of this season. And then Lincoln Riley out of USC. Lincoln Riley was brought to win national championships. But instead, his defense, just like Brian Kelly's, has been a disaster. Now you put him inside the Big Ten. He's moved out of the Pac-12. And now you're not just having to compete with Washington or Utah and Oregon. You replace Utah with an Ohio State, a Michigan, a Penn State. Teams that kind of had their hold on the Big Ten over the last decade or two. So I honestly say, out of all the coaches, I think Brent Venables can manage to secure a couple more seasons, at least 2 more, with an 8-9 win, but they get a win over Texas. Kelly and Riley will have to get a 9-10 win and at least a top 20 to top 15 defense. And I'll say really and truly, more so Kelly than Riley, he has to make the playoffs. I mean, LSU will have to make the playoffs this year. And then I got some curveballs real quick. these guys aren't necessarily hot seat, and they're not really on the hot seat alert. But James Franklin and Kirby Smart, for two very different reasons, I think this year is really going to be a turning point in their longevity at both their programs. With James Franklin, he's had Penn State consistently as the third best team in the Big Ten. But he just can't beat Ohio State, nor can he beat Michigan. And when they do, they can't win the Big Ten. So at some point, there's going to have to be a break in the system. And it's either Franklin's going to eventually win the Big Ten, or Penn State is going to move on. And with Kirby, as a Georgia fan, it kind of hurts to say this. And I personally think Kirby's been great for I think he's a great coach. I've loved the system that he puts out defensively. But, and I probably sound contradicting now what I'm about to say, but with what we've seen with the off-the-field issues, especially last year alone, cannot continue with the program. It can't. And in order for Kirby to be able to keep winning games, to go back into the SEC, to compete at the national level, you can't have all those off-the-field issues. And I just want to say last year was just an exception. Last year was just one of those terrible years that everyone's going to experience as a coach, and you're not going to see as many off-the-field issues as you did last year. But to me, I think the biggest problem the cause of that problem was the back-to-backs. I said this when we won the back-to-backs. I'll stand by this until I'm proved wrong. Georgia winning back-to-back national championships was the worst thing for the program. It was the worst thing to happen to the program. Historically, it was great. But I think it has ruined the discipline. It has ruined the cohesion that the team has had, like that culture of everyone for everyone kind of mentality where they all play together and you don't have all those off the field issues. I mean, yes, you had some. Every team has off the field issues, but not like we did last year. And as a fan, as a potential, striving to be coach, I wouldn't want to see that in my program. I definitely don't like seeing that with the high school that I coach. And I didn't like seeing it when I was coaching middle school. I mean, yes, three different levels. But, being disciplined in your classroom, being disciplined off the field, especially in high school, was very important. And it's even more so important once you hit college. So I think the distractions off the field are going to have to stop. If they have another year like that, honestly, I don't know what to really expect out of Kirby, but those off the field issues are going to have to stop. Now, I'm going to take one more quick break and then come right back into it for the game day picks. All right. So this is a segment that y'all all been waiting for. I know I've probably talked a little too much. I rambled on, especially with the whole Kirby conversation. But we're going to go ahead and dive into the game day picks. And kicking us off, my first game day pick is Texas versus Ohio State. When you look at Texas' defense, they're led by Colin Simmons, Anthony Hill Jr., who last year, Simmons had nine sacks, 3 forced fumbles. Anthony Hill Jr. is probably by far one of the best linebackers in the SEC. I would honestly say he's a top 5 linebacker in all of college football. And you pair that up with the secondary that they have, with Muhammad and Taft back there, especially Taft. And, Taft is a dog. People are probably going to criticize me on this. If I had to choose between Downs and Taft, I'm choosing Taft. And, this game, I think, is going to showcase what I'm talking about. I personally believe Michael Taft is a better safety than Caleb Downs. And, on the defensive side, Downs is really going to be the biggest anchor of the defense. They lost majority of their starters last year. I think they lost several key stars in their secondary. They lost their entire defensive line. So defensively, Ohio State's going to have a lot of guys with lacking of experience. Offensively, though, is going to be their true anchor. Kind of how where Texas, I'll say their anchors defensively, Ohio State's anchors offensively. And I mentioned earlier, Jalen Sayin has to pass to Jeremiah Smith, Cardinal Tate. Now, offensively, they're not going to have Junkins or Anderson back there to kind of relieve some of that pressure off. And I think that's where Texas can really take advantage defensively, is knowing and having the ability to shut their running game down. And I think that's going to be really the best thing for Texas to do. If Texas can limit Ohio State to one dimension, and I know shutting their passing game down would probably be the most important part, but I believe as long as they don't overcommit on Jeremiah Smith, and we've seen that as a lot of the issue with a lot of games in the playoffs. Teams were too concerned about Jeremiah, and it allowed openings throughout their defense. We've seen with Texas kind of what their game plan was with Jeremiah Smith, and it worked for most. It worked, honestly. It's just they couldn't really get over Ohio State. So, and I think with Texas bringing back a lot of their players that they had from last year's team, especially defensively, I think they should be fine. And then offensively, Texas is going to be led by Arch Manning and Weiser at running back. I don't think they're going to have too many problems out of their receivers with Moore and Ringo back. Moore had 7 touchdowns last year, which was second on the team. So I think as long as Texas kind of comes in with a similar game plan on how they had in the first Ohio State-Texas matchup from the playoffs, I don't see Texas really losing this. Now, is it going to be a 10, 17-point victory for Texas? No. But I will see Texas winning by 7. Now, my next game day pick will have to go to a Sunday matchup between Notre Dame and Miami. When you look at this matchup on paper, both teams are introducing new quarterbacks. Now, one has a little bit more experience, Carson Beck from Georgia, than C.J. Carr, the redshirt freshman from Notre Dame. But I think where Miami is offensively going to be dominant, and I don't think they're going to really lack behind, because, you got Mark Fletcher taking over at running back. You got C.J. Daniels coming in from the transfer portal to kind of fill in the gaps where Restrepo and Horton and George kind of left off. Offensively, I think we're going to see the same Miami team that we've seen last year, but it's just that defense. They went out into the portal. They grabbed a ton of players to kind of fill in and help improve that defense. But I think Notre Dame overall is a more sound unit. Yes, they lost guys like Kaiser and Watts, but that defense is still anchored down by Bowen, Schul, and Moore, who Moore got hurt last year, and he's going to be back. And by far, I think he's at least a top 5 corner in all of college football. Pair that up offensively with Jeremiah Love. Most of the receiving core is back. So the biggest hurdle for Notre Dame will be C.J. Carr. And honestly, if Carr can perform any bit of what Riley Leonard performed last year, I don't see Notre Dame losing this game. I think defensively, they can keep Miami in check. Offensively, I think they have enough to bypass Miami's defense. Now, for my last game day pick, I got LSU versus Clemson. And in this matchup, I mentioned a little bit earlier, you got Cade Klubnik versus Garrett Nussmeier. Clemson has probably the highest roster retention in all of college football outside of Penn State. They got their receiving trio back with T.J. Moore, Brian Wisco Jr., Antonio Williams. Those guys accounted for 21 out of 36 of Cade Klubnik's touchdowns last year. Defensively, the guys that they have returning accounted for 12 interceptions and 29 sacks. And that is led by T.J. Parker, Peter Wood, Sammy Brown at linebacker. And their secondary only lost one starter. So when you look at Clemson, their entire unit is poised to really elevate them through a win. I don't think there's any question marks on that entire roster. And I think the biggest question marks will come down to LSU. And it's not their offense. And I've said this entire podcast. Offensively, LSU will finish top 10 in the nation. Offensively, I don't think they're going to really have that bad of a problem competing against Clemson's defense. It's all going to be about, can LSU's defense really compete? And I think with Weeks and Perkins at linebacker, especially with Perkins coming back at linebacker is going to do tremendous. It has a tremendous effect on how LSU's defense performs. I don't think their front seven is going to be as bad as some folks probably believe. Their biggest question mark will be at their DB department. But I would say as long as they can keep as long as all three of those receivers don't get 100 yards, and they can keep at least one receiver getting 100 yards, and turn this into an offensive. And if it turns into an offensive shootout, I think Garrett Nussmeier and the LSU offense just has that little bit more oomph, especially out of their running back. I think Cade Durham's really going to be the factor here if it turns into a shootout. He was a freshman last year. He accounted for over 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns, my bad. And he's going to take that year or two leap. And he's going to be the key factor if this turns into a shootout. And I don't think with the weapons that they have offensively, with Baron Browning, Aaron Anderson, Chris Hilton Jr., Garrett Nussmeier really performs at that Heisman level. I think Cade Durham will really make that big difference and really will change the tide in the game. So for me, it's really a toss-up between the two. I see either Clemson winning by 10 because it's going to be a shootout, or LSU going to win by 10 because it's going to be a shootout. Either way, I have this game being a shootout. I don't think this is going to be a defensive game. But I'm going to stick with what I've chosen all offseason long and what I've chosen throughout all week. And I'm going to ride with the LSU Tigers. Now, like always, I'm going to have everything that I talk about here. If y'all wonder about all my takes and everything that I talk about, go to my socials on Instagram and TikTok. I'll make sure I put them in the description again so y'all can find them. But like always, let's enjoy some football.